In October of 1962, the world held its breath over missiles in Cuba. School children practiced hiding under their desks from the blinding flash of atomic fire. Leaders in Washington and Moscow stared across a precipice into the abyss of mutual annihilation. This is the history we know, but it is a lie. A cover story. The nuclear warheads were a distraction. The true payload, hidden deep within the humid, salt-caked hold of a Soviet freighter named the Alexandrovsk, was not man-made. It did not tick. It did not contain enriched uranium or plutonium. It pulsed. It healed. And it was growing unstable. The most dangerous object on Earth was not a bomb. It was a patient. Our story begins 54 years earlier, at 7:06 in the morning on June 30, 1908. Above the remote Tunguska River basin in Siberia, the sky was torn asunder. Not by rock and ice, but by flesh and light. An object, bleeding plasma and energy, descended not like a dead stone from the heavens, but like a wounded animal seeking refuge. It impacted with the force of 1,000 Hiroshima bombs. It flattened 2,000 square kilometers of forest, snapping ancient trees like twigs, but it left no crater, no fragments of nickel or iron. The first scientific expeditions reported anomalous radiation, mutated plant growth, and a strange, unsettling silence in the woods. The official record calls it a mystery. The secret record, bound in the leather folios of Tsar Nicholas II's Okhrana, called it the Visitor. By 1910, a secret expedition, led by the Tsar's most trusted mystic and a disgraced biologist, reached the epicenter. There, they did not find a meteorite. They found a core, a pulsating, crystalline organic heart, a dozen meters across, buried in the permafrost, healing its own cataclysmic wounds. It communicated not with language, but with waves of complex radiation, rewriting the genetics of the soil around it. It was alive, and it was incomprehensibly alien. The Tsar believed it was a sign from God. His biologist believed it was the key to eternal life. Both were wrong. Before they could truly begin their work, Russia was consumed by revolution. The Tsar and his secrets were executed. The Great War and a bloody civil war buried the Tunguska report under years of chaos and bloodshed. The Visitor was forgotten, sleeping in the ice. Until 1927, a young, ambitious commissar in the new Soviet OGPU, digging through old Tsarist intelligence archives for monarchist sympathizers, stumbled upon the file. The report was dismissed by his superiors as imperial fantasy, the ramblings of a mad mystic. But the commissar, a man named Lavrenti Beria, was intrigued. He dispatched a small, deniable team of geologists to the coordinates listed in the file. They did not all return, but the ones who did brought back impossible samples. Flora that grew in total darkness, water that held a low, persistent energy charge, and a single, small, crystalline shard that, when exposed to electricity, began to replicate itself, consuming the energy to create mass. It was the philosopher's stone, born from the stars. Stalin was informed immediately. The site was cordoned off by the NKVD. An entire region of Siberia vanished from all official maps. Here, in the harshest climate on Earth, the Soviets built Sharashka Zero, a secret city, a prison camp for the nation's brightest minds, dedicated to a single, monstrous task: to understand, to tame, and to weaponize the Siberian patient. But to understand how this clandestine project allowed a technologically backward nation to leapfrog the West, we must first examine the patient's terrifying biology. The early years were a litany of horrors. Scientists who got too close suffered from accelerated cancers, their own cells violently rewritten by the artifact's radiation. Containment fields, reverse engineered from the object's own energy signature, would inexplicably fail, turning entire laboratories and the men within them to vapor. The Soviets were not conducting science. They were performing technological necromancy, attempting to divine the secrets of a dead or dying god. Yet, through brutal, inhuman sacrifice, they learned. They discovered the patient was a biological engine, a living factory. Its cellular structure was a quantum miracle, capable of manipulating atomic bonds, of transmuting elements on a microscopic level. It was this secret, this ability to persuade one element to become another, that gave them the bomb. While American physicists in Los Alamos were struggling with the painstaking, industrial process of uranium enrichment, Soviet scientists at Sharashka Zero, guided by the patient's emissions, learned to enrich plutonium almost organically. In August of 1949, when the West detected the seismic shock of the first Soviet atomic test, they were terrified. Their intelligence agencies had predicted, it would take the Soviets at least another decade. They assumed spies were the cause. The truth was far more alarming. They weren't competing against a rival nation. They were competing against a stolen miracle. This single event had a terrifying, unforeseen consequence. It tipped America's hand. The nascent Central Intelligence Agency, sifting through the wreckage of Soviet intelligence, found nothing. No stolen blueprints. No network of master spies that could explain such a leap. All they found were whispers. Rumors from defectors about a miracle weapon in Siberia, a power source that was not of this earth. The paranoia in Washington became a quiet certainty. The Soviets had found something not from here, and so the Cold War as we know it began. It was a charade, a global theater of proxy wars and ideological struggle designed to mask the real conflict. A desperate American attempt to figure out what the Soviets had, and a frantic Soviet effort to master a power they barely understood. Every major event was a shadow play. The launch of Sputnik in 1957 was not about prestige. The satellite's strange, elliptical orbit, and its constant beep beep were a test. The Soviets were trying to replicate the patient's ability to manipulate gravitational fields on a small scale. The beeps were not a signal to the world. They were telemetry, reporting back to Chronoshift 0 on the performance of a drive system born in another star system. The American response was panic, and it gave birth to NASA. President Kennedy's 1962 speech, his famous declaration to go to the moon, was not a message of hope. It was a declaration of a search. The entire Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs were, at their highest, most classified levels, a hunt, a desperate search for the patient's origin. While the public saw brave astronauts, the intelligence community saw reconnaissance pilots. Probes like the lunar orbiter weren't just mapping the surface. Their ground-penetrating radar was searching for non-terrestrial alloys, for the wreckage of other visitors. The race to the moon was a race to find another Tunguska event, to level the playing field. But back in Siberia, the playing field was beginning to crumble. The patient was changing. For 50 years it had been dormant, a healing but quiescent thing. Now, it was waking up. Its energy output began to fluctuate wildly. Its mass was increasing not by grams, but by kilograms every week. The strange radiation it emitted began to affect the minds of the personnel at Chronoshift 0, causing waking nightmares, shared hallucinations of star-strewn abysses, and dying alien worlds. The patient was not just an artifact, it was a consciousness. And it was in pain. Khrushchev, receiving increasingly panicked reports, faced an impossible choice. The greatest asset in human history was becoming the greatest threat. It was growing beyond their ability to contain it. A meltdown would not be a nuclear disaster. It would be an extinction-level event, a biological and physical reality warp that could unravel the entire continent. They couldn't destroy it. They couldn't control it. So they made the most audacious gamble in history. They decided to send it home. The plan was codenamed Operation Celestial Ark. They would move the patient, now housed in a new, mobile containment unit, to a secret launch facility being constructed in Cuba. The island's position was ideal for a launch into a specific deep space trajectory, a trajectory calculated from the patient's own faint, repeating energy pulses. A biological SOS. It had been transmitting for half a century. The IRBMs, the nuclear missiles that so terrified the world, were merely the fence. They were there to keep the Americans out, while the Soviets prepared the real cargo for its journey. In mid-October, the freighter Alexandrovsk left its port in Sevastopol. Its manifest listed agricultural machinery and medical supplies for their Cuban allies. Deep in its reinforced hold, shielded by lead and cooled by a constant flow of liquid nitrogen, the Siberian patient began its journey across the Atlantic. The fate of the world now rested on a single, secret ship. On October 24th, the American naval quarantine line went into effect. The world watched as destroyers and aircraft carriers took their positions, forming a steel wall around Cuba. President Kennedy had drawn a line in the sand. He, and the world, believed it was about stopping nuclear missiles. He had no idea he was quarantining a creature from another world. Aboard the destroyer USS Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., a young sonar operator stared at his screen in confusion. His equipment was designed to track the metallic hulls and propeller sounds of Soviet submarines. But he was picking up something else from one of the surface freighters, the Alexandrovsk. It was a low, rhythmic pulse. Biological, it sounded, to his baffled ears, exactly like a colossal heartbeat. The report was logged, dismissed as anomalous acoustic phenomena, and filed away. The world was on the brink of nuclear war. No one had time for a ghost on the sonar. No one, that is, except a handful of men in a windowless sub-basement of the Pentagon. a department so secret it didn't officially exist. For them, this report wasn't an anomaly, it was confirmation. Because here is the secret that hides another secret, the lie that underpins the lie. The Tunguska patient was not the only visitor. The United States had a piece of the puzzle too. Not a living entity, but something else. An engine? A weapon? A communications device? They called it the engine. For 15 years, the engine had remained inert, a silent, indecipherable trophy kept in the Nevada desert. But American scientists had a theory. The engine wasn't broken. It was listening, waiting for a signal, a key. What if the Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't a Soviet gamble that America was forced to call? What if it was an American trap, carefully laid and brilliantly executed? What if Kennedy's quarantine wasn't designed to push the Soviets away, but to draw one specific ship, the Alexandrovsk, closer to the engine's listening range? The Americans weren't trying to stop a nuclear war. They were trying to hijack an alien SOS call. Because the Pentagon's deepest thinkers had a terrifying theory. The signal wasn't just an SOS, it was a key that could open a door. And while the Soviets were desperately trying to lock it behind a departing guest, the Americans, they wanted to see what else might come knocking. Two superpowers, playing a chess game with cosmic fire, and the entire world was the board. On October 25th, at 3:17 Zulu time, the Americans made their move. As the Alexandrovsk crossed into the engine's optimal reception zone, a signal was sent. Not a weapon, but a whisper, a carefully crafted electromagnetic pulse designed to piggyback on the patient's own broadcast. The effect was instantaneous, and it was catastrophic. They had assumed the patient's signal was a simple beacon, a lighthouse calling for help. They were wrong. It wasn't a lighthouse. It was a nervous system, and the American signal wasn't a whisper. It was a jolt of pure adrenaline stabbed directly into its heart. On the bridge of the Soviet freighter, Captain Borakov watched in horror as every gauge connected to the cargo hold went red. The internal temperature was spiking, liquid nitrogen boiling away into the void, and the heartbeat, the slow, rhythmic thump that had been the background noise of their entire voyage, was accelerating. But it wasn't just a physical reaction. The patient was a psychic entity of unimaginable power, and for the first time in 50 years, it was awake. And it was screaming, not with sound, but with thought. The psychic shriek washed over the quarantine line, a wave of pure, undiluted terror. It was the feeling of being buried alive, of drowning in ice, of being hunted by something ancient and vast. In the Pentagon's secret sub-basement, the men who had orchestrated the intercept stared at their own readouts, aghast. They had wanted to open a door. Instead, they had shattered the window and enraged whatever was looking through it. Khrushchev had been right to be terrified. His creature was the most dangerous thing on the planet, but the Americans had just made it infinitely worse. They had taught it that it wasn't alone. They had given it a target. And now, trapped in a steel box, surrounded by its captor's enemies, the Siberian patient began to do the one thing the Soviets had prayed it would never learn to do again. It began to adapt. It began to change. The crisis was no longer about missiles that could destroy cities. It was about a consciousness that could rewrite reality. And it was having a panic attack in the middle of the world's most dangerous armed standoff. What happens when a god gets scared? And what does it do to the insects trapped in the jar with it? The two most powerful men in the world, separated by 7,000 miles, suddenly felt the same impossible sensation. It was not the terror felt by the sailors, but something far worse. A moment of pure, undiluted perspective. They were no longer presidents or premiers. They were specimens. The patient's psychic scream was not a weapon. It was a broadcast of its own terrifying awakening. It showed them the truth. The Cold War was not a battle for the planet. It was a squabble in a petri dish. They saw galaxies born and die in an instant. They felt the crushing cold of interstellar space and the heat of a billion suns. This was not an attack. It was a context. A single, silent question broadcast across the globe, cutting through ideology and politics. What are you? In that moment, the missiles in their silos, the bombers in the air, the submarines in the deep, they all seemed like children's toys. Dangerous, yes, but pathetically, laughably insignificant. At 6:47 Zulu, on the direct, secret order of the president, the American blockade parted. No explanation was given. The order was simple. Let it pass. The Alexandrovsk, the ship that had brought the world to the brink, was allowed to turn for home, unopposed. History would record that Khrushchev blinked, that Kennedy's resolve had won the day. The truth was far stranger. The world wasn't saved by human diplomacy. It was saved because two men looked into the abyss And for the first time, the abyss looked back and made them feel small. They didn't win a war. They just finally understood how badly they could lose. The patient was gone. When they finally dared to breach the containment unit, they found it empty. It hadn't escaped. It hadn't died. It had simply woken up and left. It had learned the key from the Americans, understood the lock from the Soviets, and on the coast of Cuba, it had opened the door and stepped through. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended not with a bang or a whimper, but with a quiet, terrifying revelation. We were never the most powerful things on this planet. We were just the loudest. And for one terrifying week in 1962, our shouting finally woke something up. We think we're the authors of history, but sometimes we're just a footnote in a story far older and stranger than we can ever imagine. The history you were taught is just one timeline. The truth is often hidden in the static between the facts, in the events that defy explanation. To see where else the timeline shifts, and to uncover the stories hidden just beneath the surface of our world, subscribe to Chronoshift.